Welcome to episode 21 of the Filmumentaries podcast. This is Jamie Benning speaking to you, as always, from my house here in southeast London. I hope you enjoyed my last episode 20, with Gavin Rothery, director of Archive. Gavin is definitely going to go on to show us the full range of his talents in hopefully another feature film or perhaps a TV series. I wish him the best of luck. If you're new to the podcast, do check out my previous episodes. 20 episodes laying before you, speaking to people from puppeteers to editors, stunt performers, sound editors. And while there's no direct connection between these podcasts, I guess there is a sprinkling of Star Wars in a lot of them, whether it was an inspiration for the people that I'm talking to or whether they worked on those films themselves. And for this episode, episode 21, I'm speaking to another member of Star Wars alumni, Patrick McClung. Patrick, or Pat, worked for a number of effects houses over the years, ranging from physical effects to CGI as well. Pat's been around, he knows everyone in the community, and is a really sweet guy to talk to. I should add a small disclaimer here that whilst I was doing the interview, I was going through what's turned out to be an allergic reaction to a particular food that I'd eaten. I go a bit quiet, I don't say much, I just let Pat talk, so if you're wondering why I'm not asking so many questions, that's the reason why. I actually ended up in hospital shortly after this, but I'm pleased to say that everything seems to be all good now. So here's my chat with Patrick McClung, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. So Pat, how did you end up making miniatures in the movie industry? Did it start with you making models as a kid?
You know, oddly enough, no. My brother and I would make model kits as fast as humanly possible, and then we'd play with them and blow them up or burn them, as kids do, with firecrackers. And my father built beautiful model ships with all the rigging and all that, and he was trying to get me interested, because he had bought me an airbrush and showed me how to airbrush, but I sort of wasn't interested. I was more interested in electronics, and so this is the mid-'70s. And it wasn't until later, I really couldn't go to college, and I later found out in the early 90s that I'm dyslexic, because back then, there was just no way I could handle college. So I went in the Army, and one of the few times the United States was in between wars, not much was going on. So I went in to study computers and was back east studying them, and it was all this old stuff, and I found out I would get stationed in the U.S. because at the time they were sending people to Korea, and if I switched to telephone switching equipment, I would get stationed in the U.S. So I did that. I got stationed in San Francisco, the Presidio, which is hands down has to be the best post in the Army in the world. It was, it's almost like, if you go there today, it's identical to what it was like back then. It was an open post. So I was there for a couple of years, and that's when Star Wars came out. And I had a roommate, we had a room, and it was 2 per room. And he ultimately went to USC Film School, so he would tell me about filmmaking. I knew nothing about it. So, I'm very visual, but I can't draw. And I had some ideas for I love spaceships. I love building, or the idea of building an entire universe that doesn't exist anywhere. That's why I love Disneyland, because it's so well done there, going there as a kid and just building an entirely different environment. And that's what Star Wars did, it had a very used, real feel to it, unlike one of my favorites is 2001, but that was all sort of, polished, brand new, spaceship. Star Wars is sort of used, like the things you see out in the yard, used cars and what have you. So I wanted to make I thought, I'll make some spaceships. I know the basics, and because I couldn't really draw them, I tried drawing. And so I went out to the hobby store and got some plastic and made an X-Wing, a laser tower, and another design that I made. And so this was shortly before I got out. And so I got out and I moved back in with my parents in near Pasadena. And Star Wars was huge, and it played at the Chinese theater, I think, for a year. I think it was a solid year it played. That's how popular that movie was. So I didn't know how to get into the business. I knew ILM was somewhere in Van Nuys, and I used to drive around, think I could find it. It's an industrial building, and I couldn't. So there was a place in Hollywood called the Hollywood Book and Poster Company, and it just closed down a few years ago. And I went in one day and I asked the woman behind the counter, I said, can I leave these models in the window just to generate some interest? And she said, sure. And as it turned out, the part owner of the company, this guy named Steve Barquette, was doing a low-budget movie. And he needed a production assistant, gopher, to help build sets. And he saw that I could build models, and there was a spaceship in it. So he hired me, and, for not very much, but it was a lot of fun. And I met Robert Skotak on that. That was one of his first things. And we're friends. I just talked to him last night, so we're close friends. And so I worked on that. We had a lot of fun on that. And then I somehow, I don't know why I didn't do this before, but I looked in the phone book, and there was ILM's number in the phone book. And I called over there and I talked to Grant McCune, who ran the model shop. And at the time they had done Galactica, Star Wars. They built the whole facility, paid for it by Fox, and it was sitting there. And basically Universal rented the whole facility from Fox, I believe. And at some point Lucas wanted everything, because he was going to make a sequel, so they gave it to him. But this is after Galactica was done. And Dykstra set up his own company called Apogee. And so the Lucas people came in and completely cleaned out the building, there was nothing left. And so John was in the process of putting this company together, and they were going to do Altered States, Paddy Chayefsky's Altered States, and he was on tap to do that. They were building a facility for that, but it wasn't ready. And so Grant was really nice and met with me. Actually met him over at Dykstra's house. They were all there meeting. And I had put some of my models in the back seat, and I had a little portfolio. And he gave me a number to a place called Universal Heartland, and that's where Galactica had moved for, the next phase. And I think Apogee, it was called Universal 5-7, I think, before Apogee. That's what Galactica was under. And I think they did 6 or 8 episodes, and then Heartland took over. So I went over and interviewed with a guy named Dave Jones and Pete Gerard ran the model shop. And I remember looking at some of the work. They were doing the Draconia for Buck Rogers. And I looked at the detail. I thought, oh my God, I can't do stuff like this. But they called me Friday and said, come in Monday. So I started on the Draconia and worked on that, and worked on just all kinds of things. For both Galactica and Buck Rogers. Dave Jones would bring me one of the ragtag fleet models, the background. And television, American television was, NTSC was pretty low quality. So some of those models in the distant background were just junk. They were just thrown together, but they were fine for what they were. They were built for what they needed to be built for. So Dave would bring me one of these with a sketch, and I would redo the whole thing and make it close-up worthy. Put lights in it, because I could wire. Had a background in electronics, so I could wire in either neon or small, what they call grain of wheat lights, just small lights. So I had, I could do that stuff, and I was good at painting and small detail. So I was there for, I think, about 6 months, and we were getting into Airport 79. Have you ever seen it? Anyway, we were starting that, and one of the friends of mine said, I just was over at Apogee, and I interviewed for Star Trek: The Motion Picture, and he got a job on it. And I'm a big Star Trek fan, from the original series, and I told him I'd like to go on. I let him know, and I went over and interviewed with Grant and got hired. So I worked on Star Trek, which was, at the time, it was a great book that came out a few years ago, sort of what was it called? Something Back to Tomorrow. And it's this guy named Taylor White who published it. It was apparently the guy who wrote it, did all these interviews when they were making the movie, but he never published the article. So they put it into a book. And every mistake you could possibly make was, I call that patient zero for the way they make films now. They started without a really finished script, and there's like a lot. They had a date that they had to hit, December 7th, 1979, and they had to go. So the company that had been doing the effects, Robert Abel, it wasn't happening with that company, so they had to pull away. They spent a lot of money and were not getting what they thought they needed, and they got Doug Trumbull. It was too big it was 6 months, and back then doing things where you have to build a miniature, shoot it, and optically composite it, it was time consuming. And there's only so many shots you could do. And so he got Dykstra, and they split up the work, and I ended up at Apogee. And, I was a young guy, so we were working 12-hour days, Saturdays, Sunday. It was a lot of fun. It was crazy. The place, both facilities, one was in Van Nuys, Apogee, the other one was in Marina Del Rey. They were both open 24/7, for like 6 months. They didn't close their doors because they had night shifts, and so it was crazy. And I worked on the miniatures had been built under Bob Abel under a company called Magicam that was part of Paramount. And a lot of the people I later worked with were working on these, on the Enterprise and the space, what they call Space Office Complex, and the Klingon ship. And the models were beautiful, but they were some of them were lacking in detail. So I remember we got the Space Office. That was the first thing I worked on at Apogee. And, I was putting small detail on it and painting it and so forth. And then that went back to Trumbull's to be shot. It was just a weird crossing of, they're just trying to figure things out, just hitting the ground running. So, and I'm compressing some of this stuff. So I had a great time. Grant McCune was a wonderful boss, and just a great, and everybody was great. Dykstra, we'd all sometimes at the end of the day we'd go in his office and have a beer. It was very, it was not formal at all. That was the type of, it was sort of, that period is what I call the sort of renaissance of visual effects. The old studio way had been structured, in a studio system, and I think a lot of anything new, you just weren't going to be able to do, I believe, because of budgets and in a very tight structure. And Trumbull and Dykstra and all these people they were younger guys, and Trumbull had come out of 2001 and done a lot of motorized camera work, and at the time the technology was available, it became purchasable. It wasn't crazy expensive, where you could move a camera and pan, tilt, and record a move, and then play it back as many times as you needed with extreme accuracy. So that was motion control. And so that was all outside the studios. Even though Universal had started Heartland, it was actually off-site. It wasn't on the lot. And I ended up getting in the union on that, which was, union. It was very difficult. I just came in at this window where I did 30 days and I was in. And it was extremely hard back then to get in. So anyway, every place I worked at, I learned a lot. I was always very interested, not because I wanted to supervise, I was just interested in how it was all done. How come these people used 4-perf 35 millimeter? How come they used, at Apogee, VistaVision 8-perf, and Doug Trumbull was 65, And people were always very open to tell you they're proud of their work, and I'd ask guys on the stage, how come you do this? And they'd tell me, and it was a very open, great system. I had a great time doing it. So I was not good at organic stuff, and we were getting into V'ger, and I just was not happening. And Grant sort of saw that I was just struggling with it, and he got a call from Lauren Peterson from ILM, who's doing Empire Strikes Back, and he knew that I loved Star Wars, and so Grant hooked me up with Lauren, and so I went up there and worked on Empire for a few months, probably like 3 months or 3 or 4 months, I can't remember exactly how long.
And what specific things did you work on?
It almost seemed like they didn't need me, but most everything, the Star Destroyer was built. I worked on the hospital ship. I built the basic structure of it, and I built the little pods that come out of the Star Destroyer, at the very beginning, that had the little probe droids. And I painted a lot of stuff, like they call them the sky cars over Cloud City. And I painted those, yeah. And I painted when on Hoth, they built these full-size sort of laser pair of things. They made a miniature, and I painted that, and then I did stuff on the stage. They were still using the Star Destroyer from the original movie, as a background Star Destroyer, because they had it. They had the beautiful new one that was superbly built, and it was huge. And the one that was built for the film was only detailed on one side because it was all they needed, and it had no lights in it. So the new one had fiber optic lights and on and on and on. So the way sort of motion control worked is you would shoot against blue. The camera did all the motion. You'd move like this and it looked like it was coming at you. So they do the move with what they call production lighting against blue screen. And then they would turn off all the lights, and they would turn on all the practical lights and shoot that at a separate exposure so you could get good, because otherwise they'll just disappear under normal house lights. They just get overwhelmed by the light. So we had these little strips that were backlit electroluminescent panels, and it was a flat. It's sort of what's in your screen, like the older screens. It's just a big panel that glows. And we had etched brass strips, very thin, like 2/1000ths of an inch thick, with little holes in it. And I glued these things on a piece of plexiglass or perspex, as you'd call it. And we'd shoot the model, production pass, and I would just tape these things on the side of the model with what we call camera tape. It's sort of a low-tack, it's like a masking tape. And it looked like hell, but the lights are off, so you do the pass, so you can see the Star Destroyer had all these little lights. I did stuff like that, a lot of stage work, and because I just was so happy to be there, I would stay late, and I was working late, and nobody was in the model shop, and this group of people came in. They were from National Geographic, and they were doing photos for, it was a children's magazine at the time, long gone. It only came out for a short time, but they said, there's like nobody here. Can we get a picture of you working on Darth Vader's ship, the big blue ship? And I said, I didn't work on this. It was all built. I said, I didn't work on this. And I if I'm there working on it, they said, just please, blah, blah, blah. I thought, well, I'll probably be gone by the time this comes out. And so I faked a little, working on a little X-Acto, working on it. It was just a total fake shot. And so it actually showed up in a supplement in the New York, whatever the Times or whatever the big newspaper is. I'm not from New York, so I have a copy somewhere. So I told the guys later, I said, you're probably going to be unhappy about this, and it was okay. It was all right because I was the only one there, so.
I think I've seen that picture, actually. You got longer hair and a beard, and yeah, as everyone did back then.
The beards came and went back then because I could do it. My hair was curlier. I have a guy named Ken Ralston who later went on left and ran ImageWorks. He's a really amazing artist, and he did these T-shirts. It was because at the time Marin County was known for being kind of druggy pot, like a lot of pot, and the hot tubs sort of came out of Marin County, these big redwood hot tubs, and people would so that was sort of the it was Isla was in Marin County, so that was sort of the area. So Ken did this great little drawing of Vader sort of in a hot tub, and he's got his big hat and he's got the skinny neck, and it was called The Empire Lays Back, and I have one of them left. I bought like 25 of these. They were selling them. Everybody, and I gave them out as Christmas gifts that year. And that's the shirt I'm wearing. I think I couldn't get in that now. So, but anyway, that was like they used to give away a lot of little goodies back in the day. They don't anymore.
Yeah.
And somewhere I have a great. It's sort of like a paperweight. Empire Strikes Back, about that big, and I have a few other little things. It was kind of a nice, it was sort of a different time. And this was when visual effects of this type were really new, and the studio sort of didn't understand how it all worked. And it was expensive, but you got, work that was vastly superior to anything the studios had been doing before. So they paid for it because it paid off, and they knew it.
And what did you do after that?
Things were winding down, so I left and came back to Los Angeles right around Thanksgiving, which is the 27th, because they gave us all a frozen turkey for Thanksgiving. There was like a pallet of... I remember I brought it back as carry-on luggage. My mom cooked it. But so after that, 1980, there was a lull in work. I had worked steadily since I started, and really sort of mid 78 on a lot of things. And a guy named earlier, when I was going to go on to Star Trek, a guy named Chuck Comiskey called me about a movie that Roger Corman was doing called Battle Beyond the Stars. And at the time, I'd already got my job on Star Trek, and I said, thank you very much, but I'm working. And I said, I know this guy, Robert Skotak, you might want to talk to him. So that's how, and he was also recommended by some other people. So Chuck hired Robert and his brother Denny, and they were building miniatures out in the Van Nuys somewhere for a while. And then eventually Corman bought it actually had a big sign that said the Lumber Company, and it was a hardware store. And he built a facility, and Chuck had talked him into building this whole place, and it could also be used to shoot movies, which he did. He shot 1 million low-budget movies in the 80s or so. So Battle was done there, and they bought a motion control system. So Chuck called me, I don't know when, it must have been the summer, and said, do you want to come and work on Battle? I said, sure. So I went over and worked with the Skotak brothers and a lot of other people, and it wasn't super well paying, but it was good. It was something. And I had a good time because you could sort of do whatever you could do that looked good. They were very happy to get because they couldn't get the top tier people. So they left us on our own, and Robert was the supervisor of his unit. And then there was this guy that I met named Jim Cameron that had just started there. And he, have you been to Los Angeles? Have you been out here?
Yeah.
Well, he lived in Orange County in Fullerton, which is a long drive away, and he had gotten the job there through, had gone through Chuck. And he and a guy named Alec Gillis were friends, and they both got hired at the same time. And Alec Gillis has a company called ADI, Amalgamated Dynamics. He's a makeup guy. Another good friend of mine. And so Jim started out doing miniatures, and he's, super talented. So he eventually did illustrations, and then he moved up to, he knew how to run a camera. So he moved up to running his own unit. And he built the front projection system. That's another whole interesting process. Roger wanted this one ship called Nell. I don't know if you're familiar with the movie, to be sort of a flying naked woman. That was the story that I heard. So a nude woman, the feel of a feminine shape. And so Cameron did a really great illustration. He's a really amazing artist. And so they said, yeah. So he and Alec made that model. And when I got there, it was probably 2 feet long, something like that. I ended up finishing it, doing the final detail and paint and all the lighting and everything in it. But Jim was, he's a little older than I am. He's about close to a year older. And we liked all the same things, all the same science fiction, the same, the Outer Limits. There was a magazine called Analog, which is still published. It's science fiction and science fact. That was their whole thing. And so he was a lot of fun, back then. But he was driven, he just had a powerful drive, and he stepped on a lot of toes to do his thing, but he was very talented. I remember one day Robert said, he goes, either Jim's going to kill himself or we're going to be working for him one day. Because he was a crazy driver. He had a couple of accidents that he said were not his fault, but he was a nutty. I mean, I went down one day with him and went for a ride and drove very fast. So anyway, I worked on Battle, and then '81. I think it was, I guess it was '81. My friend Dave Jones, who had been at Heartland, he had gotten a job at Disney, at the park end of Disney, which was called WED, W-E-D, Walter Elias Disney. And they were doing, they were working on Epcot, and there was a pavilion. It was the GE Pavilion, and it was all about happy futuristic tomorrow stuff. And they had an underwater community, they had a desert community, and a space community in the future to show how great everything was going to be. So they had these really elaborate films, and Dave was in charge of all these things, and he boarded them, figured out everything, how the camera gear, all this, and we shot in the underwater miniature and the desert miniature were, I think it was like 30 feet by 40 or 50 feet. They're enormous, and we had this big overhead gantry system with a camera that could look down and fly. Had parallel tracks that could fly the length of this. It was really amazing. And we shot in the same hangar where Greg Jean was at when he did 1941, because I had gone down to visit him. I met him, and he invited me down to see the place. So I was on that for like a year, and then I oversaw the space stuff, which we ended up shooting it once the two big miniatures I was building. We were building the spaceships, and they were doing the bigger miniature stuff. Once we were done there and sort of cleared out of the hangar, we went to is it stage 2? The stage is still there. Is it 2 or 3? At Disney, because they had built their motion control system for the black hole, and that was actually sort of built into the concrete foundation of the stage. And on the other side of the stage was the tank for 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It's still there. It's just under platforms, So we shot, we shot there and finished all that stuff up. And they were doing, it was interesting because Disney had been in sort of stasis when Walt had died. It just hadn't sort of gone anywhere. And the lot was beautiful. It was manicured and really great. And I used to wander around at lunchtime, because they had a whole back lot of homes. They just finished Something Wicked This Way Comes. So they built like a whole city center, and then they had homes, and then it would sort of turn the corner and go back the east side of the lot, and they had sort of a western town and then a Spanish town for a TV show called Zorro that was the late 50s. And all that was still there. And at this point, they decided to, I think they brought in Katzenberg and Eisner to try to get the studio going again. And the first movie they did that was not G-rated was Splash. And they were doing that. And so Daryl Hannah would park in front of our stage in the morning. She'd drive in a Jeep with her hair, so I get a cup of coffee and I wait for Daryl Hannah to pull up. She was gorgeous. And I'd go sometimes and watch them shoot that. So that was a lot of fun working on the lot. And then, as the studio started going, they started tearing down. It was kind of sad, the back lot, so I felt I was lucky to see it before it was gone.
Is that when you ended up on Blade Runner?
I ended up through Greg Jean on Blade Runner. It was a weird deal. At one point, Trumbull was going to do Firefox, and Greg Jean had started. They built the Firefox, and I actually was working on the Firefox for Trumbull's, side, and then literally in the next room was Blade Runner. And one day, didn't work on Firefox very long. One day, Greg came in and said, "Well, Firefox is going somewhere else. Go work for Mark Stetson." Mark was running the shop on Blade Runner, so I went next door and worked on Blade Runner. Not for a real long time, because a lot of the stuff was built. I did a lot of casting and molding and a few things, and but I had promised Grant McCune I'd come back if he got a show, and it was Firefox. So I really didn't want to leave, but I said I would, and I told Mark, and he was fine with it and everything. But as a matter of fact, I'm just thinking when we were doing Blade Runner, it was being financed by Filmways, and they had gone out of business, and Trumbull came in and told us, he said, well, they're going to try to, sort of find financing, but it might be a few weeks or a few months. and they were going to shut down the production, and it was Wednesday, I remember, and that was it. It was over. And then after a few months, it started back up again, and I went back on it. And then later, Firefox got going, and I went over and worked on Firefox. I think somewhere in there, I think Boss Film started. Because I was I ride my bicycle down to Marina Del Rey. So Richard Edlund basically just took over Trumbull's facility, basically bought it. It was called EEG, Entertainment Effects Group. And so he separated from ILM and got 2010 Ghostbusters at the same time. So I remember I rode my bike down to visit Mark Stetson. He had a little shop, I think, at that point. And he was in the back of a big truck, and they were taking stuff somewhere. And he said, "Call me in 2 weeks. There's a show starting." So that's how I got into Boss Film. And I was there for on and off for almost the whole run of the place. It was just a fantastic place to work, and I did most of the work there on the Leonov and some other ships. I did some work on Ghostbusters, but it was, two fairly complicated films going on at the same time, and nobody had done that at that point. It was a lot of work because, unlike the digital work today, you can buy the equipment, you can buy the software, and you can learn it, and you can do it anywhere, in essence, You can set it up in a hut, in Hawaii. But back then, the equipment was all specialized, and it was all prototypes. They're all one of a kind, So there were only a few places that could do that kind of work. So this was a lot of work in a very short period of time to do both these films, which we did. Mark was a great boss, and Edlund is a great guy. I still see him here and there, and that's where I met John Bruno, who was, the way Boss worked and the way ILM worked is you had a main supervisor, and then you had all the departments. So you had a guy that ran the model shop, a guy that ran the camera, and storyboard, art department. So you'd start up, and then the model shop guys would start building the miniatures and figure all that out, whatever was going on there. And then the art department guys would start figuring their thing out, and the optical guys. So the person that I saw on the stage most often, because we were in two buildings. We were in the Glencoe building where they did Close Encounters and everything, and Blade Runner. And then around the corner was the Trumbull, the main building, which we all moved into eventually, but on Maxella, that's the street. And so Bruno was the guy that I saw all the time, when we were shooting everything. Because there's a shot, you can see it online. We built this forced perspective street that's in front of it's an actual building in New York that's right across the street from the Central Park. And you see the guys are looking down as the Marshmallow Man is walking down the street. Well, we built that whole miniature. It was off the ground it was a big platform. It was off the ground about 2 feet, and underneath there was a slot in the street, and all the cables that ran the facial movements ran through the suit, down through the back of, the heel of the guy who was in the suit. And below him were the 2 carts full of puppeteers. They were laying down, pulling levers, and they had a monitor so they could see what they were doing. But there's a shot where you can see 2 people standing with their facing away from you. And if you go online, you can find the shot. And there's a thin guy that has, I think, a dark shirt in the middle, and that's me. And the guy to the left is a guy named Leslie Ecker. You can see more of his face, but that was when I was thin, a long time ago. So yeah, so I was.
That's cool. Nice to have nice to appear in it yourself. Yeah. So on Ghostbusters, then, would you have been doing things like making the buildings around the Marshmallow Man?
Yeah.
And the tops of the buildings?
Yeah, I worked a little bit on that. The buildings were built for Blade Runner, and Mark had them. And they were built as regular buildings, brownstones or whatever you call them, and then they retrofitted them with all the tubing and whatever, so they just yanked all the tubing off and gave them a facelift, and we built all this fun stuff on the roofs, chicken coops and, all kinds of things, and there are all kinds of things in the windows going on. You don't really see, but I just don't remember what else I worked on. I worked on some things because the building was sort of built by a guy named Milius Roman, who did most of the it's a hotel, or I guess it's an apartment building that they used in New York, but the top section is the Ghostbusters, the whole temple. So we built the top of the building. It was pretty big with the big temple bit, and so I didn't really work on that, because that was a lot of cutting holes in wood and making. You make like one or two frames, and you just cast a million of them, window frames, and they're all made of urethane. They were silicone molds and urethane castings, and so our mold making guy was cranking these things out by the hundreds because there are a lot of windows. And we had a sculptor that did the big panels that exploded and all that, but I didn't have much to do with that. I was mainly in 2010. I would go back and forth on some Ghostbuster stuff. There was a lot of sort of cross-pollinating with us. Mark would say, "Oh, jump on this for a while." So I might work on some for a couple of days and go back, to Leonov or whatever. And I think so after that, I think the next thing we did was, I think it was Poltergeist 2. And we built, there was a shot that was, I can't remember, it was going to start high and go into Carol Ann's room through a skylight, or start on her and go up. So we built in miniature their house and two houses on either side. We built this huge thing, and then they didn't use it after it was all built, and they were beautiful. It was a beautiful model. But I think around that time I believe is when I got a call from Robert Skotak about Aliens. Poltergeist 2 was winding down, so I told Mark, I said, I have this chance to go work on that, and he says, yeah, go for it. So Aliens is another whole story. So I went there and worked on that. I tend to drift and go on into minutia, so I'm going to try to move a little faster on this stuff. So worked on Aliens. It's another whole story. We can get into that. And then came back and worked at Boss, and I think I was working on, what happened at the time is that ILM just got all the big movies. Just, Lucas would help get them in there, but, and Boss was every bit as good as ILM. So there was, down in Los Angeles, was Boss, Apogee, and DreamQuest was coming up, Hoyt Yateman's company. And so those companies were always fighting for the scraps of the leftover movies. And so I worked on something called Solar Babies, which, it's awful. We did this big dam. It was really amazing. And then
there seems to be quite a lot of interchange with, the people that were in the industry at the time. You talked about like at the initial days of ILM and how, you would all kind of know each other, quite a small industry. Was it like that up until that point, up until what we're reaching 86, aren't we, for Aliens?
There was a point until right before the digital age where I probably knew 90% of the people, camera people, because we would sort of, go from one show would end at one company, and it was freelance. So then you'd get picked up at another company. So there was a lot of moving around, and so I don't remember what I worked on after those two things, but I ended up going on to The Abyss because Boss was going to do The Abyss with John Bruno supervising, and there was a meltdown about a budget or something, and then it wasn't Boss. And Boss had nothing, and there was no work, and so Jim wanted me to come and just handle the miniatures. They were being built by another company in Los Angeles, and we were going to shoot in South Carolina. He just wanted me to sort of maintain the stuff out there. So I told Stetson, I said, well, there's nothing going on here, so I'm going to go do that. And he said, fine, because he had no work. And so off we went. It was June or July to, what's it called? Wallace, was it not Wallace, Idaho? Gaffney. Wallace, Idaho, sorry, that's Dante speak. It was Gaffney, South Carolina, which was a tiny little town. And outside the town, the only place you could build one of these was a reactor that was being built by Duke Power, the local power company, in I think the late 70s. And something happened, and they built an enormous amount of concrete work. They didn't get anywhere close to finishing it, and it was a big failure, bond failure, big failure. It was like, I think, $800 million that was spent on this facility, and they just pulled the plug on it. So there was this big cylindrical building. It was enormous, and in it was what I call like a salad bowl, a big bowl. I think it was 250 feet by 60 feet, concrete. That was going to be the containment structure for the reactor. So that was the 8 tank. They built the whole tank, and then there was another area that was basically an enormous basement, a concrete basement. They never built anything, and that was down like 20 feet, and then within that was yet another depression, and that was the B tank where we shot most of the miniature stuff. So it was that was a brutal project as far as hours and so forth. I think the first month I worked 12-hour days every day. It was crazy. And
how aware were you of how crazy a project that was at the time? I mean, here's Jim Cameron, somebody you'd worked with, and he was, as you said, he was a good illustrator, model builder. To reach those kind of heights where he's confident he can pull something off that's so left of field, like an idea of shooting this film underwater in this huge unused reactor. Was there ever a point where you thought Jim's gone too far, or
no,
were you always confident that he was going to pull it off?
Not at all, because he's pretty amazing, and I thought if anybody could do it, it would be him over any other director in Hollywood. Because Jim he has an interesting sort of makeup, because he has the left and right brain, whichever one is which. He has the artistic side, but he also has the sort of physics, mechanical side, and he understands both. And sometimes a lot of directors have an artistic side, but just technically they no idea, and vice versa. And Jim can design something and then even design the mechanics of it. So and he's, I think he read all the books on how to make films, and they said, you planned the film out in pre-production. So everything Jim did was thoroughly planned. When we were doing Aliens, we were doing video previs. With at the time it was the small camera, but it was like one of these giant cameras, and it was just foam core models of everything, of the APC and it was just. But what Jim would do, he would just. I wasn't involved too much of that. It was Bob and Denny. It was on the weekends, and Jim would just labor over these shots. He'd look at them, we got to do them again, we got to do them. But those shots were cut into the film in editorial, and that was the shot. So what we do is we just take that video, and there's the composition, there's everything, the timing, everything. And so it was a blueprint for the shot. And in Jim's movies, pretty much you read the script, they pretty much are the movie. And one thing that's great about Jim is you have a question, and he can articulate his answer in such a way that he's so clear, and he can then draw a picture because he's a great artist. And that's one thing great about him. He knows what he wants, and a lot of directors don't. They have a feel for, it's sort of how it is. But Jim is, at least with him, is that it's not going to be a wishy-washy, I don't know. It is very distinct. This is what I want. But he's very particular on stuff. And then it gets into minutia of move this, do this. And, more on the digital side. But
what I was going to ask was, something like, you were doing the detailing on the Sulaco ship, right? For Aliens. How much guidance did you get about what kind of level of detail to give the ship in terms of what shots it was going to be used in? Or do you go for as much detail as possible in case he wants to shoot it this way or that way?
Yeah, we had two illustrations from, what's his name? The designer.
Sid Mead.
Sid Mead. And Sid Mead, I loved his style, and he did the Leonov, but no two shots were the same. Proportions were different and everything, and we used to get these pictures at Boss, and we would sort of fill in the rest, because a lot of the model makers that had come that were on Star Trek were harvested from art center. A lot of the guys that I knew came out of the product design, so they knew how to build. They were shown how to build prototypes, but they were artistic. So Leslie Ecker was like that, Mark Stetson, and a whole group of people. And but to wind the clock back, the Sulaco, I built a foam core Sulaco, just a rough one that was probably 5 feet long or something, just to do the story, the animatics. And at one point, Aliens was more or less a low budget movie. It was very tight, and one of the reasons he got Robert Skotak was that they'd worked together, and Robert knew all the in-camera techniques. He'd sort of been a film historian, and he knew how to do all this stuff. It was sort of a lost art with beam splitters and foreground miniatures and perspective miniatures and all this stuff. And I learned all that stuff from those guys. And so it was going to be a really tough shoot, really tight. But Jim wanted the Sulaco to be like 15 feet long, whatever it was. It was like, I said I can do it in 6 feet. So my standard thing is I always hold my arms out, which is 6 feet, from fingertip to finger. I could do it this big. It was like, that was my standard size. And he goes, okay, because he knew I could do it, or we could build it. So we had a really good model shop, and I was sort of, there and gone for a while and came back. But the guys were great, really good model makers and great people. And towards the end, I had the guys start on the basic structure of the Sulaco, and I don't know if they were quite used to winging it, if you know what I mean, because usually the art department had generated very precise blueprints that a lot of the model makers went by, and a lot of the stuff we were doing, I think they just weren't used to a sketch of something and building it. But they did as we got further along. I think they enjoyed that because they had a little bit of artistic freedom. And they built the Sulaco, and things were winding down, and the detail work was good, but it wasn't the Sid Mead style. And and Jim looked at it, and he looked at it, and he goes, well, they were just gluing little square chips of styrene on it, and that wasn't what it was. And I thought, I'm going to have to do it. So I spent the next month or so, it was like towards the end of it, working on the Sulaco, and sort of rebuilt some of the midsection, reproportioned it, and so forth. So the guys built the basic structure, and then Robert and Denny would come in sometimes just for therapy and work on the model as well. And there was no rear view of the ship. That Sid Mead didn't do a rear view, so Robert and I came up with the engines, and I was very happy with that model. We did all kinds of. I think you call it sellotape. We just call it Scotch tape here. The thin tape. And I'd done this on something else, and I would take tape and I would lay it down on a piece of styrene, and then I would very carefully cut it into strips and shape. And I'd pull it off with tweezers, and I would put it on the ship for very low paneling. And so there's like a lot of that stuff on it. And then I would do we call sort of burnishing, and I would take a single-edge razor blade and sort of scrape it over the paint. The paint was a very flat paint at the time. You couldn't get it in the UK. It was a company called Railroad Colors. It was for railroad stuff. It was a very flat finish and really high quality paints, and I brought all that stuff with me. And so I was trying to get something where by dragging the single-edge razor blade across certain panels, they would reflect differently. So as it moved past the light, you get different reflections off these panels. And I wasn't there when they shot it. I think I'd come home by then. And I know Robert wanted to put like needles in little crevices just to get a very sharp zing, of light off of it. He that was being shot over at Brian Johnson's company at the time. They had a motion control system and I'll compress this. We went over there with a company called LAFX, and it didn't work out with them. It was a long story, and they left about. I think we got there in July of 1985, and then they left about Christmas time, somewhere in there. And they brought Brian Johnson for insurance, but Robert pretty much did the whole show, and Brian was there. And Brian was good with dealing with the studio people and all that stuff, But he didn't have to do all that much on the show because it was already going, and Robert had his relationship with the crew and everything, and they were moving along. But so the Sulaco, probably of all the things I've ever made, that's the one I'm the proudest of. And it's out in Burbank with Bob Burns.
It still exists, right?
In his collection, yeah.
Okay, we're about halfway through my chat with Patrick McClung. We'll be back after these short messages.
Here's what some people are saying about the Projection Booth podcast.
The Projection Booth is single-handedly the greatest film podcast you could ever listen to or could possibly want.
Top notch. 5 stars. This has quickly become one of my favorite film-related podcasts. Always interesting.
A completely unpretentious yet fully comprehensive look at films from all genres.
The Projection Booth podcast, with new episodes available every week at projectionboothpodcast.com.
Are you tired of pop culture podcasts where the hosts exist in a constant, blissful state of agreement? Well, fear not. Let me introduce you to the Chinstroker vs. Punter podcast. Mike is an ex-film student with a penchant for David Lynch, and Paul is your man on the street who likes what he knows and knows what he likes. Join us fortnightly as we discuss what we've been watching from our own very different perspectives. You can find us at csvsp.libsyn.com. Chinstroker vs. Punter is a proud member of the Pod Syndicate family of podcasts.
I was reading the J.W. Rinzler Aliens book recently, and I don't think I realised until fairly recently that there were quite a few miniatures involved in Aliens, not just the ships, including the Queen Alien and Ripley and the loading bay.
Well, I was there when it was done. There was a lot of the egg the egg laying sequence where she comes in and shoots her grenades, and blows up the eggs. When the Queen tears loose, God, was that a rear screen shot? It was a very complicated shot because they had, fire doesn't scale. Water and fire don't scale. And so what they were doing, they were using mirrors in the back. The Queen's here. They were using mirrors to reflect a large fire over there behind her, and they were using the beam splitter, which is a semi-silver piece of glass. I don't know if you're familiar, but if you strip off the backing on the mirror, the metal that has been deposited is very thin. There's hardly any of it there. So these are so they look like a very shiny piece of glass. So if you put it at an angle, the camera's looking this way to whatever's going on over there, something can reflect back into the camera, and that's also front projection. And so fire is pretty bright, so they were beam splitting foreground fire to get the scale with the Queen, but this Queen was quarter scale, and she rips her. It starts with she's laying an egg. It's this big ovipositor thing. She's laying this egg, and it was a guy reaching from behind the set with an egg on a stick, pushing it out, and there was a mirror to block what he was doing there. And this big pan up to her, and that was all a quarter scale. That was just like a standalone shot. That was all done in camera. And then I think Ripley was in a rear screen shot with her. Must have been. I'd have to go back and look at the movie.
Yeah, but the loader stuff as well. Was that some miniatures in the loading bay, the power loader?
Oh yeah, that all the wide shots are quarter scale miniatures. Yeah, The Queen was sculpted by Stan Winston in quarter scale, and then it went over to a guy named Doug Beswick's shop, and Doug Beswick did. They were puppets, and all the cables went down through the legs, and the feet actually had sort of a stick on it. So underneath the set, people were, there were slots, and they were making the thing walk, and the same with the power loader. So they were all cable actuated. And he built the power. Jim designed the power loader, and then John Richardson built it. At Pinewood, and there was a guy, a bodybuilder inside of it. And some of it were supported by cables from the top. There was a rear mount that picked it up. But for the wide standalone shots, the full-size one couldn't move at the speeds it needed to move with the Queen, because the Queen was enormous. And so the decision, we went with quarter scale, which really was too small, really, for what we were doing, but it was a cost issue, To go up to third scale, it just would drive the cost up, and there's other issues that come up, physical issues with the weight of things, and so it works pretty well, but it just really, that's what we had to do. So the wide shots where you see, Ripley hitting the Queen, those are all intercut with the close-up stuff from the full size to the miniature. When the power loader falls in, into they call it the vertical shaft, that's of course our miniature, and we only had one of those. And so after we were done with all the, and they were beautifully made, they were just beautiful. After we were done with all those shots, we had to have the shot of it falling away, where Ripley is holding on, and you're looking down at her point of view, where the power loader is at the bottom of the door, the Queen is, halfway up to her, and the door opens and the power loader falls out. Well, they just cut off the cables, just at the feet, we only had one. And they took this vertical shaft miniature up to the top of the stage, mounted the camera looking down, and they had a bunch of people with black material, like a fireman's thing, and just Christmas tree lights for stars. And it worked fine. And so they released it, and unfortunately they didn't hold as tight as they should have held, and the thing, it hit the material, went right down to the concrete floor and exploded. And the model shop was almost gone at this point. And so I scooped up the parts, and I went back into a back room with my hot glue gun and literally wood sticks and glued it all back together. And I had a can of spray paint, yellow paint, and I detailed it and we reshot it, and that's the shot in the movie, the smashed one falling away.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, one thing I learned from Bob, he goes by Robert now. He used to be Bob, but he's Robert, is what you really need and don't need in a shot. And I remember Denny, who's the DP, the camera guy, he told me this trick years ago. He said, if you want to see what the camera sees, he says, close one eye. Now you got, binocular vision, and squint. And a lot of detail disappears. And I realized when we were at the bigger companies, we overbuilt stuff. And there was a reason for that, because they were spending so much money and they wanted to come down and look at it, And all our models were exquisite, but they really were overbuilt for what we needed. But with the Skotax, I saw, because of the low budget world and Roger Corman's, what you really truly needed to do to get away with it. So I knew that I could sort of glue this thing together and make it look decent enough where it would just work and you'd have no problem with it. So we did. Does
it make you effects guys nervous when you see these new 4K scans of the films coming out?
No.
That might kind of, because still that level of detail is what was necessary.
Yeah, I mean, 4K is like 70 millimeter resolution, more or less. It's film resolution, and we're making, because I did a TV show for Marvel, and it was shot on, it was called Runaways. It came and went. I did the second season. We were shooting with the Arri Alexa, the Mini, and it's I think it's a weird size. It's 3.8K. It's not quite 4K. And we did all the visual effects in that native resolution. And then at the very end, they bump it up to 4K, because everybody wants 4K in their library for future whatever. So the work really is almost for TV at feature levels now. If we projected it probably large, I'd probably see stuff, but I would look at it on a big television. And so as the resolution increased, we just dealt with it. And I was very happy with the work we did on that. Some of the stuff I was new to television, and we're doing some of these shots within just like 2 or 3 weeks. really complicated shots. But we plan up front, and a lot of what happens on feature films is the post is long because they're editing sound and music and all that. So in a way, the directors have a lot of time to tweak and noodle these shots. In a way, it's too much time because they go, they look at it and they go, well, I really want to change the background. It's like, it's like, that's a lot of work. I go, okay, I said, it's going to be a lot of work. I always tell them, but it's going to be a monetary hit. But with television, like commercials, you have a time limit. And, and a lot of what was happening on the TV show, they were just leaving it up to me to do a good shot. I'd show them the executive producers, that is, I'd show them a basic what we were doing, and then I would finish the shot. I think I have a pretty good eye for this stuff, and they were happy with it. And I thought, I wish features were like this, because a lot of times a director will do stuff that doesn't work, that I know is not going to work, and I tell them it's not going to work. And then after the movie that comes out, they go, oh yeah, you're right, but it was too late. But so TV has its interesting demands, but it's sort of brutal. I sort of wasn't, I knew in theory, but not in practice, because you're doing pre-production, production, and post all at the same time because of multiple episodes. And it's just a sprint, and I'm not a young guy. I could do it, but it was 12-hour days. Just the moment I set foot on the property, Paramount, we shot it. So after a while, and luckily we I think we only did 2 weekends. We had some night shoots, but luckily we had the weekends off. But I would leave here at 6:30 in the morning because of where I live, to drive to Paramount, and I would get home at 8:30 at night. Yeah, so
there's only so long you can do that. Yeah.
Yeah, and
winding back the clock a little bit. Like I was thinking, all the movies you mentioned so far, or the vast majority of them were science fiction. They were spaceships. Working on something like Die Hard in, what was that, 1988, 1987, I guess you were working on it. Was that a big difference? Well, for a start, no spaceships, and therefore, is there more scrutiny that goes into making miniatures for real world because we're so used to looking at it every day?
I thought, oh, great, we're actually getting into what visual effects have been before the big science fiction, phase. Because before that, effects were in there for, all kinds of things, trains and people in front of, mountains and what have you. So these to me were like a standard visual effect. We built the Nakatomi Plaza, which was the Fox Plaza in miniature, and I think it was 30 feet tall. And there were more shots planned for it. We built this whole thing, and they dropped a lot of the shots because we were going to do a lot more explosions up there. And then we did a larger. I think the top 8 floors in scale to the radio-controlled helicopter. We built that miniature. And we just shot that all in the parking lot. And then we did some other miniatures for the exploding 3rd floor. It was actually a miniature that was all done in shiny black Formica, his countertop stuff. And so it was matched to the actual plate that was shot on, at Fox, and because it was black, you couldn't really see it, and it was shiny, so it reflected. So we had like an opening where the 3rd floor would be, and I had little sheets of clear styrene and all this debris, and blew it out, and it works pretty well, but you could see the reflections on the shiny material that laid in over the real building, so it looked pretty good. Then we did a first perspective elevator shaft. When McClane throws the chair down, the chair was a motion control shot, but the elevator shaft was, I think it was 12 feet tall. It started out about 6 feet, and at the bottom, it was like that big. So everything was, from your perspective, it all worked, but it all sort of shrunk, and I had to do lights that were smaller in size going down there because they're halogen lights, so I ended up with doing that. And our pyro guy Thane Morris came up with a low temperature explosive. What I mean by that is that the standard stuff they use was called naphthalene, burns very hot, and it sort of destroys the set every time you blow it up. A lot of work in redoing it. And he used a stuff called I think it was called benzyl peroxide, and it burns at about 120 degrees, and you get this great roiling fireball. So we had very little repair work on it, so that was fun. But that was sort of going back to what I think visual effects were, meant to be. And then after that, there were sort of more of those type of things. And, Richard, he always wanted to shoot large format because remember the days of the Xerox machines. If you Xeroxed a picture and then Xerox the copy and then Xerox the copy, it would build up contrast. And that's what film did when in the 4-perf size, which was the standard size. And so if you had a larger negative, like VistaVision was horizontal with 8 perforations, so you just had a little bigger area, and then 70 millimeter was larger yet. It helped mitigate some of those problems. But Die Hard had a lot of other stuff that they wanted after it was shot to add. There was something in the parking structure where they wanted to add like another whole depth to the parking structure. So in 4-perf, they rotoed out the back wall and put another shot back there, and you just can't tell. And there's a lot of stuff where McClane is jumping over, you're looking up, when the explosion happens, and they had to slip the timing because the I think it was a stunt guy, but they had the fire didn't go off, it went off too late, so they rotored him out and just slipped the timing. So and you can't tell. So some of that stuff was pretty invisible. There's a lot of that kind of fix-it stuff. And so I think I did that right before. That's what I must have done right before The Abyss. Must have been, that was 87. I have to go back and look. But that stuff I sort of, because I'd done so many spaceships and I love spaceships, but at some point I thought it'd be nice to do something different. So the space stuff was sort of wearing off, and they now realize that there are a lot of things you could do with visual effects for regular movies. And that was one thing that Jim did with Aliens, is that he expanded his world with rear screen. For instance, Ripley in the elevator. That was a shelf about 3 feet wide. It was a metal shelf, and we turned it sideways and glued a bunch of junk. And there was a guy named Mark Harris, who's still a friend of mine. He was a set decorator. And he got he went to these companies that made injection molded television cases, all these, and he got all this plastic stuff, and it was all sort of very intricate. So we glued a lot of that and painted it, and I put Christmas tree lights in. And we turned the camera. Denny turned the camera sideways, and it was on a roller, and so we'd be rolling down. It looked like we were going, up or down. And so that was rear projected, and it gave a lot of depth with a really minimal set. It was just the elevator set, which was just, the background was just some sort of fencing, And Jim knew how to use visual effects to get more for his money, in essence, with shots. And so some of that started happening. People were getting a little better about that sort of thing, And then there's always matte paintings. And it's funny, the matte paintings, when you see a film is designed to be seen as film, projected film, and transferring it has always been a big problem because the digital stuff, which looks good on the big screen, sometimes it doesn't. It's really hard to transfer it to a totally different format, because now you're seeing it on a television screen, which is a different way of presenting the image, and some of that stuff looks great on the big screen. It just looks like crap on the small screen. You can see it. And unfortunately, a lot of people are seeing these movies in a venue that they really were never meant to be seen in. And if you didn't do the transfer right, because the classic one was the Wrath of Khan. ILM did the visual effects on that, and they were when you see it in film, the space was inky black and everything looked great. When they did the transfer, because it was one of the first VHS tapes I bought, it just looked like crap. All the black space it's called lifting, where it's not deep black, it's sort of gray. And somebody just didn't take care, so the effects didn't look very good and showed a lot of the matte lines and things that you would never have seen in the theater. So yeah. people.
I remember seeing the Star Wars on video in the 80s, and you could see the garbage
Yeah.
mats kind of as the TIE fighters were flying
And you
across.
didn't see that in the theater.
No, absolutely not.
There is a classic, I'll go to this real quick, a classic movie. It's one of my favorites I grew up watching on television called War of the Worlds in 1951, and the Martian war machines were suspended on little wires, but that was shot in 3-strip Technicolor, and Robert Skotek, he saw it when he was a kid. He said you couldn't see the wires when it was a Technicolor print, and I remember sometime in the 80s I went to see it at one of the theaters, and it was the Technicolor prints don't fade like regular prints, they just stay pristine. So I saw the movie in Technicolor, and number one, the color was fantastic, but the wires were gone. The film was slightly soft. It has like a slight softness, and it was enough that you didn't see the wires. And then now a lot of films I've seen, they'll do sharpening in the transfers. Like 2001, and I've seen some other things where they'll sharpen the grain. The grain just looks like crawling, That should not have gone out that way, but 2001, you could actually see the pieces of Scotchlite material in the Dawn of Man when the monkeys are beating each other up. The screen was made of this material that 3M made called Scotchlite, and they had to, because each batch was slightly different, they had to cut up rolls of this stuff in like 2x2 squares and mix them all up and then put them on the screen. Well, you could actually see the edges of the Scotchlite on the Blu-ray, and it's too sharp because you didn't see that in the theater. There was enough softness. It's a piece of film going through a lens onto a screen, and you lose a lot of detail in that process. Whereas if you're scanning the original negative, there's a lot more latitude on the original negative, and so you're getting more detail than you would have ever seen on a screen. So film was balanced for film, and when people do these transfers, I don't know if they're thinking about, how this was originally viewed. They probably had never seen it, in its original form on the screen. But anyway.
Yeah, I think sometimes they're driven by the highest quality, regardless of the fact that, as you say, it probably wouldn't have been shown in that kind of state in its initial release. One of the other things I was interested in asking you, Pat, was about the kind of arrival of CGI, and was there a feeling of, impending doom amongst you practical guys? And
well, Jurassic Park, when I went to see Jurassic Park, and I thought, oh crap, if they could do organic stuff this well, and it still holds up, I gotta say, the original movie still holds up quite well, in some ways better than some of the newer ones, but I thought,
Agreed.
At some point, what I'm doing is going to go away, and I was plotting my escape, and when I was at Boss in the early 90s, there was a point when there was no work, and I would go off, and they'd get work and I'd go back. But John Bruno called me and he said, "Oh, Cameron is setting up his company, Digital Domain." He said he was going to do True Lies, and he said he wanted to come and run the model shop, and I was sort of hesitant. I said, "Yeah, then I'll do it." And in the plant, whatever you want to call it, the building was, we had the miniature shop, and then we had the office, and then the digital building, and I would go over there all the time and look at what they're doing. And I have a background in computers from way back, but this is sort of a different level. And I thought, well, at some point this is just going to get refined to the point where it'll replace miniatures. So I did. And at the time we had hardly any facilities, so I farmed out the whole bridge thing to Mark Stetson, because he had a company, and basically Mark did all that stuff. We shot it in Florida, and which was the way to go for the lighting, because Jim wanted us to shoot it in L.A., and we sort of cooked the books on shooting at Universal with their big backing, because when we were in Florida, I told John, Bruno, I said, the quality of light is so different in Florida than it is in L.A. You'll see it, So it was going to be expensive, so we sort of said, "Oh, we'll have to do this and that." So we shot it where it should have been shot, in Florida. So anyway, the next thing was Apollo 13, and I had more of a shot, or more of a shop at that point. So that was Rob. And
was it Rob Legato?
Legato, yeah. It's what I call Legato. Yeah, Rob. And so he wasn't available to talk about how to do everything, so I just figured it out on my own, what size the miniatures would be, what to use, and we had a meeting, and he goes, okay, and then off we went. So I ran the shop on that, and then my friend Les Ecker, because we were doing commercials and I was sitting at a computer more than anything at that point, bidding on stuff and doing commercials and whatever, and Leslie was the crew chief, so he was there doing the day-to-day stuff, and everything came out really well. I was really happy with everything, but they started doing some digital work, and I thought, this is it. And I talked to Cameron, I talked to Jim one day, and I said, I'd like to move up to supervisor, and he said, okay. And the guy that ran everything, Scott Ross, Jim told Scott, and they, and I had been around. I used to go with Bruno and look at, he'd do his rounds up in the digital, and I'd look at what they were doing and had a basic understanding of compositing. It's sort of the same structurally as optical compositing. It's layers, like Photoshop. It's very similar, and so I knew enough to be dangerous, as the old saying goes. So, but I had a knowledge of the physical photography end on the set, and so there's still a blend of miniatures and digital at that point. There was still an interesting blend. So the first thing I did was Sergeant Bilko, which was a Steve Martin movie that just disappeared into obscurity, and there's a hovering tank in there. So we built a miniature and built a big, or the guys running the shop built this, because I was like, I don't have to do that anymore. And I said, let's build a platform that's a few feet off the ground, and we'll have a track under the ground. The rod will go in through under the miniature. We could just have this thing hovering around, because it's going to be this far off the ground, blowing dust out. And what we used to do is we would get this plastic that you'd have an opening in the platform that was about this wide. It was wood, and then we put this plastic over it and slit it, so the slit would sort of open and close to hide itself. And that's what we did at Ghostbusters. It's an old trick. And so we did that, and we had some green screen behind it to composite the background in. We shot up in Simi Valley. And that stuff came out pretty good. And then I went on to a thing called Chain Reaction. And there was a supervisor on the production side, Nick, and I knew him. And basically, he brought the show to DD, and I just told him what I wanted to do. And then we got the show, and we just pretty much did it all, And somewhere in there, so I'd done 2 little shows, One was 30 shots, and the next one was maybe 60. And then Dante's Peak came in, and I went on to that, and that was like, I don't know if I was quite over my head, but I was, because it was there were 2 volcano movies. There was Volcano over at Fox, and we were a Universal, Dante's Peak, and they had what I call pissing contest. Usually somebody would say, we'll do our movie next year, but they kept changing their release dates. Somebody would come out earlier, then the next one would come out earlier, and then at some point I thought, I don't know if we could do some of this stuff. We had so little time. And then Volcano, they moved it completely to different, I forgot the different end of the year. So that was a crazy film to do. And we got it all done, and it was brutal. I mean, it was like, I remember I calculated, we built this gigantic miniature out in the Van Nuys Airport, and it was this big valley, and we had behind it, around the corner, it was all designed. We had a big tank up there. It was just a big round metal tank. I think it held 300,000 gallons of water, a giant hydraulic door, and the water would come down and turn a corner and come into the set, and it had to be tinted gray and all this. And I counted up the shots. We'd had to, because we shot in Wallace, Idaho, was this town in a valley in the summer. So when the sun would go down, you would still have, over the mountains, you'd still have 4 hours of flat light, magic hour, they call it. And the idea was that when the volcano went off, it's all, soot in the air, so it's all flat light. But now we're shooting in December in L.A., and no flat light. There There's no clouds. So we designed the model so in the morning when the sun came up, it was a valley. The sun came up over here, and so we had a certain amount of time before the sun crested and lit the other side of the valley. So we would do some shots in the morning, and then we'd wait till the sun got all the way to the sunset side and did the reverse, and wait till the sun dropped below the crest of the other side of the valley. And I did a calculation. I thought, we don't have enough days to shoot if we stay with these shots. And I thought, oh shit, literally we were like down to not being able to shoot it. And I did some other things where it did what they call tiling. A lot of the guys, when the vehicles, I don't know if you remember the movie, when the vehicles jump over, as the bridge is disintegrating, these people standing there's the background, which was all green screen. And I talked to a guy, I said, can we just shoot individual squares and then stitch them all together and make a background? He says, yeah. So that's what we did, and that's what sort of saved us is and you can't tell, it's done really well. But I wasn't quite prepared for it, because I had always been not the top guy. It had always been Bruno, and what I wasn't prepared for is the relationship with the director and everything, because I've always been the guy in the back, so that took some getting used to, how to deal with directors and all that stuff. I've gotten better at it, but it took a while, because I was, even though I was in my 40s at the time, it was I could do the effects. That stuff I was confident in. But it's actually this social interplay between all these people, which I never thought of. I never considered it, and the directors want what they want. And it turned, Roger Donaldson was a great guy, but he wasn't very, in my opinion, very visual. And we'd show him designs, we'd show him maquettes of terrains, and we'd start building it, and he'd come in and go, and we were hurting for time, and he goes, guys, it's not going to work. And I was like, and we figured it out, but he would have to see it, once it was built, that he was one of those guys. But I like Roger, and we had an amazing crew, but it was a crazy amount of work to do. And it's oddly enough, I knew all the guys on Volcano. There's this guy named Matt Beck, who's a friend of mine, was supervising that. And all the other people were on that movie, and they were doing a Batman movie. There was a lot of work that year. One of the Batmans was across Van Nuys Airport had these big hangars, and they were just raw space, and they were doing the Batman movies over there. And then Boss Film was doing one of the Harrison Ford, I call it the suit movies, where he's wearing a suit. I know it was Air Force One, or I think he's got 2 movies where he's in a 747. And I'd walk across and visit all the guys over there at Boss, and this beautiful 747. Dave Jones is running that. And I go look at those guys, but at that point, that's when we sort of all knew each other, and that was right before the dawning of digital. And once digital sort of got it going, when I sort of got into visual effect supervising, that's when there was this huge influx of people, because at the time when DD started, there weren't a lot of people that could run this software. And they got a lot of, it was very expensive. People could demand very high rates. And I thought, well, in a few years, there's going to be more people, and there's going to be a lot more, competition out there. And that's what happened. Because I remember back then, a 2-element composite, let's say a person in a car, green screen, background and person, was $5,000 or $6,000 for a composite. Now people would do it at home for $500. I can do it at home on After Effects. So that's interesting how the software got better, and there was more people, but it was really the software getting a lot more user friendly, because there was a market for it.
Do you think there's come a point now in Hollywood where directors and creative people can still see the benefits of a physical miniature as opposed to doing it CGI? There seems to be a lot of productions that kind of, boast about we're doing it practical to kind of, I don't know, whether it's to attract a certain audience or, is it there for the right reason?
It's like the Christopher Nolan thing. Christopher Nolan was cutting film on a I forgot which film, it was a few films ago, on a flatbed, Yeah. And it's like
an old Steenbeck or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. I'm sure it was Steenbeck. And I thought, well, yeah, okay. Because every time you have to do a cut, you got to mark the film, you got to pull it out, you got to cut it, you got to cut the two ends, and the assistant editor has to put it on this little bin and keep track of it. And whereas on an Avid, it's bing bing, and you've cut it, and you can save it. So that was just for the sake of, that was just his thing. And I don't know, when I saw the first J.J. Abrams Star Trek film with the new guys a few years ago, the visual effects, the spaceships were stunning. I mean, I looked at them, I go, oh my God, these are really good. And right now, there's not a lot, if anything, I would use a miniature for, and that's where I started, And I tell people that, and they're all, aghast, but, it's, yeah, you can do it with miniatures. It's to shoot something is fairly expensive, and that was the cost. I did something for, John Bruno was doing X-Men 3 years ago, and the story was different at the beginning of the movie, and it changed at the end, but Magneto lifts the entire Golden Gate Bridge up and plunks it down between San Francisco and Alcatraz. And John wanted to do a lot of that miniature, and I hadn't done miniatures in a lot. I wasn't working, and he's a friend of mine. He said, oh, can you do this down in L.A.? They were in Vancouver shooting, and I said, well, I sort of don't do that anymore. I said, if I can oversee the shooting, I'll do it. If I can shoot the photography. And he says, yeah. So we built this 50-foot long miniature of the Golden Gate. The Golden Gate Bridge is all length. It's like about a mile long altogether. So we built a large section of it, and then part of a tower. And we shot quite a bit with it. And John wanted to extend it with digital, and I thought, I would have not done that. This is just my own personal preference. It's just made for digital. It's a hard-bodied thing. It's not like you're doing a human being or something with hair at the time. This is just made for digital modeling. So we did use some of the stuff where you're looking at the whole bridge lands on a sort of a guard shack, and so there are some things. And we also built Fort Point and crushed it. That came out pretty good, and they didn't use it. So I think John's, after that he pretty much steered away. But a lot of the film changed, and so that approach was a moot point because they rewrote a lot of the script. And so we did it, and it was it was a union shoot. And not cheap. But the studio got to use a lot of it in the trailer, so they were okay with it, I guess, But like I say, there was a movie called First Man, about, Neil Armstrong, and what was kind of interesting is a lot of the shots they did were the classic shot where they have a camera bolted on the wing of an aircraft or looking at a rocket, sort of like documentary style. And what they did is they had these LED panels that are good enough now that you can use them for backgrounds. And so the LED panels, along with motion control, are lighting the model. So that stuff looked, for what they were doing, it looked really good. But not everything was done that way. And did it need to be done that way? Sometimes it's a sales thing with the supervisor or the director, like I want to use models, and okay. But right now, especially for TV, no, there's no way to build stuff and shoot it, and But the thing is too is that you can not endlessly, but manipulate it later. If you've shot a model, you can't move over here and shoot it from this angle. It's done. It's struck. And so with a digital thing, you can, and the quality is such now, it's so good. Even the smaller companies that are doing the TV work, because a lot of the people that left, when features sort of left here, they went to Canada and the UK and Australia, the tax rebate thing. A lot of people left and moved to Canada. And so, but television sort of filled the gap. So a lot of people that were in films are in the television end. So the television is still strong, and a lot of it they still want to keep in LA because of just time, I guess. I don't know. But the quality work is superb now. So yeah, it's sort of sad the models went away, but it's I was talking to Robert Skotak last night about this movie called Mank. That there's not much. It's slim pickings this year for films, and I said you should see it. I liked it a lot. It's not a great film, but it's really interesting. And they had I'm on this email list for the American Cinematographer. And they had an interview, and I can't remember, it was a famous cinematographer, and he had Fincher and the DP, who I can't think of his name, he's a young guy, who shot it. And they were just talking about using a digital, an Alexa, but it was a black and white image sensor. It was not a color image sensor. You take the color out later. It was black and white. So they, I don't know if you've seen it, the movie, but it was in essence shot in black and white. But it's so funny. Fincher's a very smart guy. I knew him years ago. He's very technically astute, And he was saying, he goes, "Yeah, I didn't use film. I don't want to use film. I don't want to go there." I thought that's like really interesting because film has a lot of inherent problems that we always had to deal with, scratches and film weave and just this and that. And I'm sort of glad it's gone. To be honest, it was the technology that we had and that we had to use. And something, in my opinion, better came along. And a lot of, certain filmmakers would probably disagree, but the average moviegoer, no idea when they're in a theater. The cinema, they look up and they don't know if it was, it's being digitally projected and shot digitally. They have no idea. They think it's film because it looks just like film. And in some ways, it's sharper and clearer than film. And you can always degrade it, and you can always pull back if you want, but it's the sharpness is there. So I'm a big digital camera guy. I mean,
yeah, it makes sense, right?
Yeah. It's just easier to deal with. Like you can, literally. When I was at a company called Fuse here in LA, and they do lots of television work, and I was doing it was a few years ago, and I knew this guy Greg Nicotero, who was on The Walking Dead, and Gail Ann Hurd. I know both of them, and Greg is a makeup guy. He's a friend of mine, and I called him up because he had told me before. 6 months before he was pitching this idea to AMC. So I thought, I'll call him and see if there's any visual effects work. And so I called Greg, and he was back in Atlanta, and he goes, "Oh, it's already done and been passed on." So it was done. But he said, "Oh, if you guys want to bid on some shots for The Walking Dead, call this guy." So we ended up doing a whole bunch of shots, and I needed, a lot of sticking knives in heads and poking zombies in the back of the neck with a stick and a lot of those kind of things, and shooting. And they gave us some elements that were shot that were not the best, like, I don't know why, but they shot milk against black. And so what I did is I got a friend of mine, and he had a Blackmagic of 2K camera, and we set up in the backyard, and I have a 12 by 12 green screen, and we put it up, and I made all these little rigs to shoot blood, and I shot all these elements of blood spurting, piles and piles of elements. And so drips and dabs, and so you could literally pull the drive out of the camera and walk in the door, and they could pull this element in 10 minutes, and it could be the artist in another 10 minutes. So literally that fast. If we shot it with film, it'd have to go to the lab and blah, 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 be scanned and everything. So that was like the beauty. And I shot some stuff at home on my kitchen table. I needed blood dripping. So I had a green card. I put that up. I had these lights. And I have a Blackmagic 4K camera. It's like the old one. But and I shot, it was like this woman gets pushed onto a pipe. Nice image. And, it was a CG digital pipe, and then there was blood dripping from it. So I got a stick about, dowel, they call it. I wrapped it in the green stuff, and I put it in I have a couple C-stands at home. And I shot, I had a little eyedropper, and I dribbled blood on this pipe so it could roll off and drip. And I brought that in the next day and gave it to the compositors, and they love that stuff, because if you did digitally, it takes a while, and it may not be what you want. And if I do it physically for that type of thing, I could get a bunch of versions, and so they can pick the one that works the best. I can just keep doing it, because I'm not, it's just a piece of cardboard that's green. I could just change it out. So that was sort of fun, and this is sort of doing things in a big hurry, Probably would have done it on a bigger show if it was a feature digitally. They could spend more time on it, but this had to be, it's like, what time is it? We gotta get a
it's what works at the time, right?
Yeah. And so the requirements are different. It's simply a time issue between features and television, and I'm a big Doctor Who fan, and I just got I didn't see them when they came out because I was too cheap to get cable or something. I don't know what the deal was, but I just got all the David Tennant shows.
Yeah.
And he was the best to me. Him and
he's
Tom
great.
Baker.
Yeah.
But and I like the other guys, but the visual effects some of them are really good in that show. As they went on, they got better and better. I think the Mill did them originally, and so
right, yeah.
There's some great. And I'm looking at it going, oh, that must have been difficult. I just sort of know I can sort of look at it and sort of reverse engineer what they had to do, and to fix stuff, and it's all sort of the same stuff in a sense. It's all similar types of shots, but I don't know who does. They had a place in where they shoot it, doing some of the effects in
down in Cardiff.
Cardiff, yeah. There was a company I looked up, and they do some of the visual effects there. I haven't been to the UK for so long for various reasons. I couldn't go. Either I wasn't working or I was working, and I really miss it.
Because you spent quite a lot of time out here over the years, I would think.
But I was visiting in the early 80s. I just wanted to go there. And, I grew up in the 60s, and I was a little kid when Star Trek came out. And my brother liked Westerns. There were a lot of Westerns on, even back then. And the other show I loved was The Avengers. I really loved that with Patrick McClung and Diana Rigg. And I would have to give up one of those shows because my brother wanted to watch. There's always, on another channel, some stupid Western. So I would keep Star Trek and I would lose The Avengers. But I just loved that show. And I remember a lot of times you'd see, outside Steed's apartment or whatever, there was like nobody. I thought, is there no one walking around London? That was my image of London. There was like no one there. And but I really wanted to visit it. So in the early 80s, I saved my money and got that book that was Europe on whatever it was back there, like $1 a day or whatever it was, and went to England, went to Paris, took the channel, the ferry, and all that stuff. So it was Aliens was probably still the hardest thing I worked on, for not necessarily for the work, but just the politics, the people we were working with. LAFX, I won't go into that, but oddly enough, Jim was a known. Bob Denny and I knew that Jim would be tough. We knew that right up front, so that was not a surprise. But we had a lot of difficulty with the crew because they didn't think we should be there, the Americans. And
Really?
Yeah, and it was it's very different now. I from what I understand, and the person that sort of saved us was this guy Mark Harris, who was a set decorator. He had worked for Jerry Anderson, right? And so Thunderbirds, yeah. And I watched that as a kid. That was one of the few shows that made it here, and I loved that show. And the Jerry Anderson sort of system was more like Roger Corman, And but anyway, Mark was incredibly helpful. He became a close friend. And but and I sort of understand why people felt this way. As Americans coming and doing the effects. Jim was an American director. His wife was producing, and she was like 29. I think I just turned 30, and Jim was 30. And Stan Winston was, he had a few of his guys, so I think that rubbed people the wrong way. Like, these Americans are coming over. But after a while, I think they realized that we are all nice people, and we eventually got along extremely well. It was a great crew. We had our own little world, the visual effects people. And one thing that Robert Skotak did that I think was a little different than the original system, I think a lot of times the visual effects were driven from the art department, and the guys would be working on these things, and they never got to see the rushes. They were sort of workers. And Robert told everybody, he said, if you want to come in, because we'd look at the rushes at 7 a.m. or something in the morning with Jim. And he said, if you want to come in on, be on your own time, but you're welcome to come in and see what we shot. But you have to leave after the first screening, because then he could yell at us, Jim. So, I think and Robert was saying, if you have an idea, let me know. If you've have an idea to do that's better than we're doing. And so he involved them. And I think that was a big thing, that's how we did it here, because we didn't know any better. We were not at the studio. We weren't in the studio system in LA. And so Pinewood was a studio system. And so it was sort of breaking with some of the traditions, but eventually it was a great group of people. I had a lot of fun. There's a lot of really talented model makers and camera people, and a lot of these people had worked on, we had a guy named Harry Oakes, at the time was about 65, and he'd worked on everything, the Bond movies. He had worked for Jerry Anderson on the original Thunderbirds and just everything. And so a lot of the guys had worked on 2001, so I could talk to them about these shows that I'd sort of grown up watching, But it was we were challenged with the money, and because Jim, he sort of plowed through everybody because this was his make or break film. He had done Terminator, but it was not a studio film, and this was a studio film, and this was the one that would really set his career. So the bodies would fly. He would just, he wanted to do something, and he would just plow through everybody and all the procedural things that people had gone through. He didn't care. So a lot of it, I found out later, sort of filtered down to us. The studio people were not real happy with him, and I totally understand why. But they sort of made it difficult on the visual effects people. And I'd actually, towards the end of the movie, I was introduced to a well-known director who told me this. He said, they have it in for you, Pinewood, like the whole place. And I won't tell you his name, but he shot a lot of films there. He's an American guy. And I go, oh, okay, that sort of makes sense. But our group was great. Our once we all really worked as a team. And it goes back to Robert Skotak involving everybody, and that's what we always did. So they felt like they were part of it, which they were. They were part of the process. So, and I'm sure it's very different now. Because after that, the industry really was hurting, and a lot of people got out of it or retired or whatever. And this is like the late 80s, and I think it all changed. I guess I haven't, it's been 20 years since I've been back there. Because I was looking, when the COVID started, I was looking at flights. I thought, the flights are going down, but I thought, it's probably not the time to go. And shortly after that, they started closing everything down. So, I thought, I don't know what I was thinking. I thought, because the cost of flights had just plummeted, I probably would have got there and had to come right back. But
hey Pat, I think we should probably do this again and have another 2-hour chat, because there's so many stories I'd love to dial in on.
Yeah, I've got plenty more stories on other films and things I haven't even touched on the ones we talked about. So we should do a part 2.
Let's do it.
Yeah,
I'm up for that.
Absolutely. Perfect. Okay, well, let me know when you want to do it again.
All right, thanks, man.
I'm around.
Yeah, brilliant.
Okay,
all right, nice
take
one.
It easy.
Thanks, mate.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my chat there with Pat McClung. He's a very sweet guy, and as we said at the end there, I think we're going to go back in and have a chat about things again. Probably dial in on a few of his experiences on those films with Cameron, and also about that transition from practical to CGI, and when he worked as an effects supervisor too. So it's one of the difficulties talking to somebody like Patrick who's had so much experience. It's difficult to pick topics to dial in on, and Patrick was just happy just to keep talking about his experiences. And maybe next time, hopefully when I'm feeling a bit better, we will be able to have another chat about some of those experiences of his. Next time around, it'll be my interview with producer and writer Ivor Powell, who I spoke to back in November 2019. I hope you've seen my short video documentary with him, which is available on Vimeo. If you just search for Ivor Powell on vimeo.com, I'm sure you'll come across it. This is a audio-only version in podcast form, which will be the basis of the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast. It will have some additional material in there because, of course, when you're editing a video, you have to take a whole bunch of stuff out and paint it and make sense of it. But I also thought it worked quite well as a conversation. Ivor's a lovely guy. We've stayed in touch for the months since then, or the years since then. And hopefully when things are opened up a bit more, I'm going to take him out for lunch and have a good old chinwag with him again. If you want to become part of the Filmumentaries family, as 43 of you have done so far, you can do that on patreon.com/Jamie Benning. You can donate $1 per episode or $1 per month. I'm going to be doing 2 episodes per month for the foreseeable future, just to make it reasonable and affordable and realistic in terms of my time, because I do have my other work to do as well. So I really do appreciate any support you can give me there. It does mean that I can spend a day doing this rather than a day of my regular freelance work. Thanks once again for listening in, and I hope you can join me again for episode 21 next time around on the Filmumentaries podcast.